All right, sorry about that. So, yeah, so for 7.2, remember, you could try it this first way, and if it didn't work, you'd know because there'd be leftover stuff. If you need to go back and look at some of those videos, you can. But essentially, this first one didn't work, even though we have odd sine. So that means we're going to go to the next one, which is odd cosine, even though there isn't an odd cosine. I know that can be super confusing. But you just gotta use what you gotta use. I mean, I remember that little, the little picture I sent y'all. So essentially, even though we have rules, sometimes they don't always work, and you have to try something different. So this is just one of those times, okay? And that actually happens a lot in 7.3. Cool. So we end up having to use cosine odd, even though we don't have cosine odd. So essentially, we have our u as cosine. We take the derivative. Whenever it starts with the c, we have a negative, and then from here, oh yeah, so our goal is to get that du. Y'all remember that? So we need to change this expression up here to have negative sine theta d theta at the end. So we can change that to du. So I'm going to take away a sine here and make it squared. And then I'm going to add a negative here. So since I'm multiplying by a negative here, I've now changed the problem. So I need to multiply by another negative to cancel out those negatives, okay? And then we can just tack that d theta on from up there down here, okay? And now, from our chart, we know that sine squared is equal to 1 minus cosine squared. So now instead of this sine squared, we're going to change that to 1 minus cosine squared, okay? So, cool. So we've done that, and now we're going to change everything with respect to u. So now, because we're changing variables again, we are again going to have to change our interval, okay? So we take our equation that incorporates u and theta, which is this top one, and we plug in our 0 and our pi over 2. So we plug in 0, we get 1. We plug in pi over 2, we get 0. Okay, so do not put them from smallest to greatest. You put them in the order that they originally were. So this one was 0. 0 is now 1, so that goes in the bottom. This one's pi over 2. It's now 0, so it goes on the top. Now, this is an issue. So remember, whenever the smallest one is not on the bottom, to be able to flip them, you put a negative on the outside. So that's what happens from here to here. So I flipped from going from 1 to 0 to 0 to 1, and then I've multiplied by a negative, which is why it's positive, okay? So now, instead of sine squared theta, we know that sine squared theta is the same thing as 1 minus cosine squared theta. But we also know that we're changing everything in terms of u, and cosine theta is u, so that's why we have u squared, okay? So instead of cosine, everywhere you see cosine, you're going to write u. So we have 1 minus u squared, okay? And then next we have cosine squared, so that's going to be u squared. And then we know that this brown part over here is always going to be our du because we pulled that out, okay? And now it's actually in a form that is super easy for us to solve. So we take this u squared, we distribute it, we get this, we've already changed that, and then add 1, divide by that number, add 1, divide by that number, and then evaluate it whenever you're subtracting. Make sure you use parentheses. In this case, it doesn't matter because it goes away, but in other cases it does. And then do simple algebra, and you should get 2 over 15.